So test, we're good. All right. All right. So good morning, and if you're joining us from home, glad that you're joining us. We're sort of gathering ourselves here in our fellowship hall, and in just a minute we'll go ahead and begin. So all of us have realized that we're running a little bit slow today, so I don't know how you're doing at home. For us, it's I was actually sitting in my office about 3 minutes ago thinking it was 9 o'clock, and if it wasn't for John to say, well, I know you're about to teach here in a second, and then I looked down and I thought, oh my word, it sure is. So, but glad you're with us. Just want to touch on a couple of announcements before we begin. We have finished the book of Ephesians. We finished that last week. If you missed a week, or if you missed a portion of the text or part of the book that's important to you, or you would like some further kind of work on it, all of it is stored online. You could just go to our website and then look for the media app, and it would be right there about a third of the way down. And then as soon as you click on the media app, it'll give you a scroll down, a drop down box, and I think like the second one says Tuesday morning Bible study. And then if you could click on that, it instantly brings you back up to all, the previous last week's stuff, but then you can easily find previous weeks or what have you. So if there is a portion of Ephesians that you want to go back and look at again, and you can actually, there's years of Bible study. So you can go back and look at all the stuff that John and I have taught for the last number of years. That's all stored. And it might take you a little bit to find like an actual chapter, but all that information is there. So the next date for us that's important is May 18th. That'll be our last time that we meet before we take our summer break. What we would like to do is weather permitting, and if the weather's nice, we want to maybe have a picnic out on the quad where we would make a box lunch. Maybe like chicken salad and a sandwich, or maybe that, or pimento cheese or something, and then we all just have a chance. You can sit however close you want to people, and but sort of wrap up our year the way we normally do. Normally we would be at someone's home, but this year probably would like to do it out on the quad. So if you're interested in that, you should have received an email from Kathy about reservations or whatever. So if you would like to do that, please respond back to us. I do hope that even if those that are at home, if you would like to at least gather outside and to whatever level of distance you would like to keep, we would like to invite you to that. But that'll be May 18th, and then of course after May 18th we'll take our summer break, and then we'll resume back as a group. After Labor Day. That's normally when we start back, and we'll start back with 1 Thessalonians. We we only have a few weeks left, and so instead of jumping into 1 Thessalonians and maybe getting a chapter or two in, and then having to break for the summer, just thought that wouldn't be the best pattern for us. So we're actually going to do some things that are tied to the Bible, and at the same time not tied to the Bible over these next few weeks. And that is a suggestion that came in, I think, last week or the week before, which is to so much of the church's tradition. I mean, so much of what we know about the Bible, at least for the first 100 years of the church, influence the church's tradition, but then at the same time, the church's tradition and the history equally influences us today. And so one person and a couple of people thought this was a good idea, asked the idea, what if we were to just take a couple of different sections of the church history and sort of unpack that in our study and see what might come out of that and how that might be helpful to us. If anything, it does give us more information. At the same time, I think it's helpful in at least us understanding why we are who we are today, but then also, why we believe what we believe. So that's what we're going to do. And so, I mean, I'm going to choose 6 or 7, well, we don't have 6 or 7 weeks, just a handful of really important times inside the church history that really sort of set a pattern or maybe a direction for the church, and try to give you some background behind that. At the same time, give you some information as in the major players, what was going on, and sort of why the church acted the way that it did, just for our own greater understanding. I do think it's helpful. Outside of the Bible, for me, the most influential part of the church that has helped me understand faith, theology, just all things related to the church has been the church's history. And I mean, to separate ourselves from that, I think is we would do ourselves a grave disservice. Actually, what has been proven in, say, church plants, whether they be inside the United States or just around the world, when there's a new church that is planted, and if it tries to operate outside of, say, the church's history, always gets into trouble. And actually what happens is they reinvent the same problems that the church addressed ages before. So, I mean, that's a buddy of mine did his dissertation on these churches in Kazakhstan. There were 7 churches that were planted, and they wanted to adopt a model that Paul had, but really they just wanted to stop like in the book of Acts, but they didn't want to go any further after that. And what they did is they actually, one of them turned into something like the Corinthian church, another one turned into something like another church, and I mean, just throughout about a period of about 10 to 15 years, I mean, they kind of went through all of this. And so it's amazing how the history can help us. So, and so this is going to be a little bit different. And at first when I thought about this, I thought, oh, it's going to be easy. And then I thought, gosh, 2,000 years, how do you pick 3 or 4 moments in time and unpack those and kind of go from there? So we'll try it. Hopefully, I think it'll be helpful, and we'll kind of go from there. But let's pray, and then we'll begin. Oh, also at home, if you received an email from Betty Hips, that's our prayer pad. I think you're familiar with the way we do it now. Just fill that out, or if you have any prayer requests or praises that you would like to share with the group, send it back in to Betty. Betty will compile it, and then she'll get it to us, normally either this afternoon or tomorrow, and we use it as a part of our devotion. All right, so let's pray. Lord, as we gather in your name, as we want to come at this study today with a number of different things. We want to come with what we know about the Bible, and then how that might be helpful at the same time as we look at human nature, and then we look at just how the Holy Spirit has guided this community of followers of Christ throughout the years. We want to be open to that. We want to learn from that. And with the exception of being separated by space and time, we would be in the same place. So we rely on you as we want to be a student of you. At the same time, we want to be a student of how you've revealed yourself and how you have guided and directed people throughout the ages with the hope that you're going to continually guide and direct us. So we pray for this now, and we ask it in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, so if you were to take, now these are just rough time periods, and but this will just kind of give you some idea of some of the developments in the church and how either the church has been on the forefront of something in history, or the church has been in some level of a reaction to something that's going on in history. This will, in my perspective, gives you some basic timelines about how to think about the church's history. Well, and obviously the first one is, and this is probably the one we're most familiar with, this would be the time of the Bible. So if you think about, say, very, very much first century, with the incarnation of Christ, his life, and then his ministry, and then his death and resurrection, and then the movement of God's Spirit through the church. You have the writing of all the different letters of the Bible, things like that. That pretty much brings us up to around 100 A.D. The last book that was written was obviously the book of Revelation. It's roughly dated around 100 A.D. to 110. The first book that was written in the New Testament is Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians. That's around 52 A.D. So everything else in the New Testament falls between around 52 to around 100 A.D. Acts is, we have Acts, and we just kind of go through it chapter by chapter. But the book of Acts is, about 25 years from start to finish, 20 to 25 years. From the time of the resurrection to the time when Paul is in prison, you're a couple of different decades. We leave the book of Acts where Paul is in Rome. That's the last little portion, and then from Paul, and then you have the writings. Some of the writings are from the disciples. Some of them are not. They're disciples of disciples, like Luke. You've got all a number of the other Hebrews, things like that. Obviously, the book of Revelation, written by John on Patmos. He's the last disciple to die right at the very end of the first century. But this is probably a period in the church's history that we're most familiar, because most of us, being good Protestants, one of the tenets of Protestantism is the importance of the Bible. So you were probably taught from, either a little girl, we have a couple of guys in here, little boy, the importance of the Bible. How long have y'all been studying the Bible? Ballpark it, all right? Many years. Is that okay? We don't need to put a number on it, but many years. So we're familiar probably with this period of the church's history more than any other time in the church's history. And that is because we have a lot of theological history, which is what the New Testament is. It's not a history book, but yet it does contain history. And it's not strictly a theological book because it does give life, right? It gives some important dates to history. So if we were to think about the church's history that's been influential in our life, this would probably be first. And this is the time of the writing of the Bible. And we're familiar with that. We're familiar with the books of the Bible, some of the history, things of that nature. And then now the next portion is what happens after the disciples die, if you want to think of it in that terms. Because, John, the disciple John, he wrote the Gospel of John, and he also wrote the book of Revelation. He's the last disciple to die. So near the end of the first century, and really for the next couple of hundred years, it's what's really is the major issue is how the church moves from its first generation to its second generation to its third generation and on down to the fourth generation. Pivotal point in this next section is 325 AD. Now, y'all have heard me talk about, and we're going to talk again about this maybe not next week, but the week after, the Council of Nicaea. It's a major date inside the life of the church because that's where we get the Nicene Creed, which is the first creed. I mean, now the Apostles' Creed, you can make a case that the Apostles' Creed was around 150 A.D., but the Nicene Creed is the first major development by all of the church. So the Roman Empire still operating here, and Constantine, you've probably heard that name, he becomes, around 300 A.D., there are three potential candidates to be the emperor of Rome. Constantine is one of them. He eventually wins. Obviously, there's some battles that take place. But in 313, that's when we have the Edict of Milan, and that's when Christianity is approved to be in a religion, an official religion of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, whenever they would take over an area, they were comfortable with local religions as long as you kept the peace and you paid your taxes. And once or twice a year, you went down to the local temple and you paid some homage to the emperor. Other than that, you could maintain your local religion. Well, obviously, from what we know from the Bible, that Judaism had a big problem with this. So did Christianity. So that's why some of the persecutions that took place throughout. But in 313, the Edict of Milan, which approves Christianity, 320, Constantine says he becomes a Christian. 325, he invites all the bishops together who have never gathered in a one-time session before because you couldn't meet. And they have a meeting for a couple of weeks to deal with something that's called the Arian controversy, which we'll get to that, don't worry. But the product that comes out of this is the first creed. Well, so when we say the Apostles' Creed, and other denominations will say the Nicene Creed or whatever, this is where it begins. And the major work of that creed is around what part of the Trinity? Is it the first person of the Trinity? All right, think of the Apostles' Creed. Where does most of the verbiage has to do with what? About Jesus. Because the issue here is, who is Jesus? And so this is where you get all types of official, this is like, what does the church believe about Jesus? Well, you see that in the Nicene Creed. And it sets the pattern for the next 1,200 years. Now, there are other creeds that come. Actually, there are 7 major creeds of the church. But it has its start here in the formal statement of faith about who Jesus is. Up until this time, there were pockets. Again, you couldn't gather for a public worship service until 313 A.D. And then you could gather, but you were still an overwhelming minority. Christianity doesn't become the majority religion or the state religion until 325. So all these things that we take for granted as just personal freedoms and religious freedoms of just kind of rolling up to the church, there were no churches. They didn't start building churches until the 350s. In the beginning, this is Christianity is a minority. It's pockets and periods of persecution until the 300s. But from the 300s on, it's like a wildfire. It's already spreading throughout the empire, but now it continues to spread throughout the empire with the emperor's blessing.
So the first 300 years was basically underground?
Yes. So the question is, for the first 300 years, was Christianity underground? Right, it was. And which led to, depending on what emperor was in power, and to what level he wanted to enforce religious rule, normally would determine what levels of persecution. And normally what would happen is you would have an emperor or two, so maybe 10 years, 20 years, 40 years of rule, and it would be intense persecution. But then another emperor would take the reins, and maybe he was sort of loose, more liberal on religious law, and it might not, then it would grow, but it just would, you couldn't just walk down to the local, restaurant or whatever and say, hey, let me tell you about Jesus Christ, because you didn't know if the person or the neighbor was going to call the local magistrate and turn you in. And that happened. Some of them because of religious zeal. Some of it would be if your neighbor was vying for the same contract that you were, and you knew they were a Christian. Human nature sort of plays in, and the next thing you know, there's a call to the local magistrate that says, Sherry, her family are Christians. I'm just telling you, they want that contract to build the brick for whatever. And all of a sudden, she would be investigated, and she would be then forced to either recant or face either martyrdom or some type of penalty, and which happened all the time. And so the book of Revelation. So this is where this part sort of shows up in, say, the book of Revelation. If you go back and look at the beginning of the book of Revelation around the 7 churches, okay, one of the 7 churches, I think it's Thyatira or maybe even Ephesus. Yeah, Ephesus. The Thyatira, or I don't think it's Thyatira, I think it's Ephesus was, at the end of the first century, they won the contract to build the temple for the emperor in that city. And so Ephesus would be like Dallas, Texas, or maybe Atlanta, large city, and a lot of traffic came. You had a port, so you had sea traffic. It also had you had land routes, trade routes. So it had a lot of stuff coming in to Ephesus, and they won the contract to build like the regional temple that once or twice a year people had to come in, pay homage to the emperor. Well, you had unions, guilds, and there was one guild was sort of in competition with another guild, and if you depending on who, if you got the contract to be the masons, you would, that's a lot of money, and so part of what Ephesus, what it says in the book of Revelation, it talks about remaining faithful, remaining true, don't lose your first love. It mentions, you can draw out some historical information that many of the Christians were laborers. And so they were faced with a faith decision. To be a Christian, I might be persecuted, and this could be financial persecution, because I wouldn't get the trade guild, or I wouldn't get the contract. So, depending on how the emperor, interpreted what level of religious law, and sometimes that was influenced by political items or other events or historical events, normally determine about what level of persecution would take place for Christians. We in the United States have no concept of persecution. There isn't a single Christian in the United States that is persecuted. Now we have is discomforts, and we don't like that, but we have no clue what persecution means compared to what persecution has meant in the history of the church, nor what it means in a place where Christianity is a minority. You can't be persecuted if you're a majority. So the early part of this, this season in the church's life had rapid growth, and because one of the seeds for growth is persecution. When it's easy, you don't get a lot of growth. But when there's separation between the faithful and the unfaithful, what happens is the church grows. It happens. You can see this in other areas, but you definitely see it here. But the hallmark date here is 325, Council of Nicaea. Now it takes about 60 years or so for what is decided here to make its way through the entire Roman Empire. They didn't have, it's not like, we didn't have news channels. I mean, something happens today. They didn't have social media. I mean, any of that stuff. So, I mean, it was snail mail. And not only that, but it was someone would have to take it, show up at the place, explain it, and then have teaching sessions on it and what have you. So the major guy that comes out of this is a guy by the name of Athanasius. And he's not a history, they didn't have pictures, but they have paintings of him. He's not an attractive guy. So I'm just going to let you know up front. If you Google up Athanasius, you're going to be disappointed. But he was very smart, 325, and all of it has to do with the nature and person of Jesus. Well, once the Council of Nicaea's teachings become the sort of, not the law of the land, but become the theological teaching of the land, you have a period in the church where from around 400 to around 1500 that is not necessarily defined by one single event. You do have the fall of Rome. So if you think back to your history, when Rome falls, you have all these independent sort of kingdoms or areas. You also have the Dark Ages. But you also, so Rome falls, but you also have now the rise of the popes. The popes sort of start to gin in the 300s, and then from then on, because one of the things the Council of Nicaea decided was that we need a theological watchdog. And so of all these different, every major center or city or area of Christianity had a main leader. So we would call them a bishop. Whether or not they called themselves that, they eventually are called bishops. And that's like the senior minister. It's not the organizational structure of the church is not as defined as it is today. So you would have the main leader. They would have people that would be under them, maybe disciples, helpers, things like that. Well, whoever that person is, that's the one that met in the Council of Nicaea. Well, one of the things they decided was not just the nature of Jesus Christ. They put it down in the official teaching, but they also said, we're pastors at heart, so we don't have the time to we're not going to be writing documents. We want to pastor our people. We want to grow our churches. So they named one bishop among themselves to be the theological spokesperson for all of them. Well, guess what bishop that became? The bishop of what? What place? Rome. So now whenever they elect a bishop, it's all the cardinals, right? All the bishops, they elect a person who might be serving in another place. But what happens once he's elected? He moves where? He moves to Rome, and he becomes the bishop of Rome. What we know him as is the Pope. Well, this is the beginning of that here. And so you have the rise of all that. You have all these different popes, and there are hundreds of them in this time period. But Christianity spreads. Obviously you're looking at 900 years. You also have, so whatever was decided here, this gets elaborated on throughout all the different creeds. And there end up being 7 of them, this being the first one. But you have like the Council of Ephesus, the Council of Constantinople, all defined by a place. But what they do is they elaborate, give further teaching on, and all of it has to do with Jesus. And you also have the rise of universities or schools. Up until then, you don't have, there's not an Emory, an Asbury, a Perkins, or a Garrett, or of any of those schools. So you have the beginning of that here, and you also have a massive building project. They start to build churches. So all those cathedrals that you visit when you go to Europe and some of these other places, they have their beginnings here. Now, some of them were built and they were destroyed and they were built, say, centuries later, but you don't have a single structure until till probably 380. So Paul, when he's in Ephesus, he's there for about a year and a half. He starts out, he always goes first where? Whenever he visits a city and wants to spread the gospel. Where does he go first? Synagogue, that's right. He goes to the Jewish people. If they receive him, then he stays there. If not, then he would go someplace else. Sometimes it's at a person's house. Sometimes it's out by a creek bed or something. But when he's in Ephesus, he actually goes to a school. It's a Greek school, but they allow him some space to teach, and he would teach when they were taking siestas. And but so you don't have an official place for Christians to gather until late 4th century. So just think about that compared to our life. So for hundreds of years, you have to gather in home churches or house churches. Think about early communion. Did they take communion the way we do? It's more like what they call a love feast. And a love feast would be like if Bitsy would invite y'all all over to her house, and it wasn't where they would take bread and then they would take a cup. They would have that, but it really was designed around eating a meal together. So you think like Wednesday night suppers, or really like potlucks. You ever we haven't done a potluck in a while with COVID, right? But, in pre-COVID days, and maybe here soon you can do potlucks again, or dinner, or supper clubs. You have those where maybe somebody brings something, a portion, they would all come, they would eat, and then while they're eating, then someone would give a lesson and then would tie it all back to Jesus Christ. But that was communion, the breaking of the bread. So in Corinthians, where Paul critiques the church, because it's that part of Corinthians says, well, when you do it this way, you drink damnation. What they're doing is some people who didn't have to work would get there, they'd eat up all the food, drink all the wine, probably be drunk, and by the time the day laborers got there, there'd be nothing left. And when an institution or an event that was designed for unity to bring people together, it actually was being used to separate people. So that's where the critique that Paul levies against the Corinthians church is like, you're missing the whole point. But they didn't meet. You just couldn't gather. One, it was illegal, but then two, you didn't have a place until 300s, late 300s. So the church rocks alone, and you have these. You have a split between the Western and the Eastern church. You have the Orthodox church here. You have the Western church, which eventually becomes Catholicism, until about 1500. In 1500, really the first part of the 1500s, you have the Reformation. And it's probably outside of this time. So, if you're a Protestant, then you're a reformer, or you're a protester to the way the church was operating leading up to this period of time. And the major players there are Martin Luther, John Calvin, a guy in Switzerland by the name of Zwingli. I can't think of his first name. And then Henry VIII. Among these theological giants, you've got Henry VIII, who's the Anglican Reformation is really because he's upset because he doesn't get his way. But there are some theological people that seize the moment, but the Protestant Reformation, even though Luther nails the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door, it probably takes about 40 years for all that to play out, but eventually the camps are defined, and you have it takes about 40, maybe 70 years total for it all to play out. But what's interesting here, just as persecution is a seed that leads to Christian growth and the growth of the gospel, the next greatest seed that takes place is there was so much theological development going on here. And so all the energy was tied to theology. So when that's finally settled, it's like the floodgates open, and you have one of the major spreadings of the gospel, probably even larger than this, just in geography. This is where the gospel goes to China. This is where it goes all over the globe. Wherever there's a known world, this is where it goes. One, you have the printing press, 1500s, right? So you have the ability to put out mass mass types of information. Martin Luther was one of the first persons to put the gospel in the vernacular. I mean, unfortunately, guess what the church service still was in? What language, even up until around the 1500s? Latin. Guess when they stopped speaking Latin? Probably around maybe the, I don't know, in the Middle Ages. And so for hundreds of years, you go to church, and it'd be like me speaking, Chinese. How many of y'all know Chinese? And every Sunday, that's what we did. And so people would go and they would sit, and what they understood was communion, because you would take the Mass every Sunday. And but Luther was one of the first persons you also have translations of the Bible that start to be in the vernacular in this period of time. So you have this massive spread of the gospel. I mean, the Wesley brothers are a part of it, right? So 1700s. So this is here, from this point on, the gospel goes to all portions of the known world. You also have imperialism. Think about all the different, like England, the British Empire, all the stuff from the New World with the Italians and the Portuguese and the French. And so there are all these colonies all over the world. Well, they take their religion with them. And so for about 300 years, Christianity is everywhere until what happened in 1914? World War I. And World War I is sort of a gut check for Christians, because leading up to the 1900s, you have what is called classical liberalism. And that is the idea that the world is always going to be getting better and better and better with the aid of the gospel. It's woven into its DNA. And so every generation is supposed to be better than the next. So it's very hopeful. The problem is, with 1914, you have massive, massive depravity and atrocities. And so World War I really becomes one of the reasons why Christianity is not as popular or as strong as it once was in Europe, is because of war. And, all sides here were Christians, with the exception of the Ottoman Empire. And yet they just annihilated each other. And so this is a pretty pivotal date. And it takes the church, it takes the world a while to get over that. And then about the time they're over it, guess what happens again? World War II. And probably around, the church is sort of just in a place of really working on theology and stuff like that. You have the Neo-Reformation, Neo-Orthodox folks, Karl Barth, Bonhoeffer, you've heard those names before. They come out of the World War, between World War I and World War II. And then around, say, the 1950s, about the time people are sort of kind of emotionally or getting over some of that, just generally speaking, you have massive mission again. And here, in the 1950s to where we are today, it's missions via technology. So think about all the technology that took place, say, from the radio. I mean, you had that before World War II, but TV, and then from TV to, you have the rise of the megachurch, now social media. I mean, who would have imagined that in 2021, there are more people who are connecting to the gospel via online ministry than they are in a live event? Well, I mean, can you imagine what it was like when, Billy Graham crusades were on TV? Some of y'all remember that. So you have just massive amount of technology here is the next wave of how the gospel spreads. And so here you don't necessarily have to be in the remote jungles of Africa for something for the gospel to find root. Here you had to be, but here in 1950s plus, you don't. And so we're living in this age of where there's massive gospel spread. It just looks different. I mean, but there are more people being reached by the gospel today than ever before. One, because there's more people in the world. Now, it's a little bit different for us because they're outside the U.S. I mean, the fastest growing place where the gospel is growing is in China and Africa today. China, underground, persecution. Africa, it's technology. I mean, you got people building wells, doing schools, doing a number of social gospel or humanitarian aid or whatnot. Well, with that is, Doctors Without Borders, things like that. Well, sometimes it shows up with the gospel, and so you have gospels touching people on numerically speaking now than ever before. So, all right, this is drinking from the fire hydrant, 2,000 years. So what I want to do today with our time is I want to focus back on this part right here. All right? So Teresa, if you'll pull up that first slide with the map. All right, good. So this will give you an idea of, I don't know if I'm messing her up by walking over here. So if you're walking at home and I just left your screen, just bear with me for a second. Before Jesus, this has the beginning of this in the Old Testament, and then at the same time, it's definitely true in the Roman world. One of the reasons why Promised Land is because it was the connection between the West, which was Egypt, and the East, which was, say, the Assyrians, all the different empires, the Babylonians, so trade routes, everybody wanted this area, which is Israel in the ancient world, because this is where East met West. And so you can see the major trade routes, well, they're all up in Israel here. You also have a coast, right? So from all this over here in Europe, this is where, some of y'all been to Caesarea. This whole area had major ports. Paul left from here. So in the ancient world, this was the Philistines. Remember those from the Old Testament? They were sea people. And they were people that relocated from Europe down into here and in the Old Testament. And so the reason why the Promised Land is, part of the reason why it's a land flowing with milk and honey is because you got all this different, if you're the connecting piece, I mean, look at all these places. If you're the connecting piece for trade, well, I mean, that's where you want to be. So in the Old Testament, definitely in the days before Jesus with the Roman Empire, this was a major area of control for empires, historically speaking, all because of the trade routes. This is where, Europe often, so when we studied Acts and we were at when Paul is in Caesarea, he's in prison for 2 years, and then eventually he gets approved to go to Rome. He gets on a ship, right? The first ship he gets on is grain. It's a grain ship, grain from Egypt. So what they would do is they would take it up here, load it all up, and then they would send it out, and eventually would be the grain that would eventually end up in Rome. So it's even though it really doesn't talk about this in the Bible, I mean, as in the importance of trade routes, it is historically very important to see why all the different struggle in the Old Testament and at least what the picture looked like for Jesus, or when Jesus was when the incarnation took place. You have massive trade routes, a very important place inside of inside of the Roman world, because where two major places were connected. So when the world of Jesus, you had a couple of different. If you can think of it in terms of Rome and everything that is the Roman Empire. Teresa, if you'll pull back up the map, sorry. So you have the trade routes. Obviously, you have Rome as the head. The Roman Empire, by the time of Jesus, would have been, it's 200 years old. So it's not like a new empire. This is when almost getting close to the height of the Roman Empire, around 100 A.D. You're in major time of Rome's development, and Rome is by far the leader. And so this area here, although important in trade routes, as for status of people, not so much. I mean, what was valued in Rome was Romans and Hellenists, Greeks, those type. Jews, Old Testament, they were considered barbaric, nomadic, just not very important. But inside that area, now Teresa, you can go back to the screen. You had three major groups of people, all right? So some of these you're going to be familiar with this. Obviously, you've got hang on before we do that. Let me just say I mentioned here, because of those trade routes being what they were always there was always rebellions, fighting over. So for people for natives that were there, or some of them would be Jews, just other people, they wanted control of their own trade, right? I mean, you want your own roads, correct? And so there were all these types of rebellions that took place. Jews hated Rome because they would force you would have to go down to the temple, you'd have to worship at least once or twice a year. They collected masses of taxes. So you can imagine the unrest there. And so for Jews, there were all these rebellions throughout their history with Rome. Probably the most famous one is the one that took place in the 2nd century BC, and that is the Maccabean. So Masada, remember when we went there? Some of y'all that were on that trip? All right, Masada was the last part of the Maccabean revolt, and that's before Jesus. And that took the lineage of Maccabees didn't always follow the bloodline. Okay, if I was a leader of a revolt and I was, say, part of the Maccabean line, then obviously it was sort of like heir to the throne. But if there was someone else who took the leadership, he would say he's of the Maccabean line. Probably not. But Rome did not like the Jews, partly because of their rebellion and their constant revolting against Rome. So one of the ways that they wanted to, after they put down the Maccabean rebellion, one of the ways that they wanted to bridge the peace this is where you get the rise of King Herod, is they wanted to find sort of like a puppet king. And Herod married a woman who actually was part of the lineage of the Maccabees. And so his claim to fame was that he also is a part of this by marriage. And so Rome put him in as a puppet king, which is why when we went back to, we were in Israel, one of the first places that we stopped was Caesarea. And remember that the remnants of that big area? That he was a massive builder, and he built two major temples to Rome. One of them was in Caesarea. So Rome loved Herod because Herod had a loose connection to Jewish leadership and aristocracy, but at the same time, he really was a puppet for Rome. He liked being Roman and being a part of that. So when Jesus is born into this type of world, where it's a little bit of a powder keg, and you've got a puppet ruler who really favors Rome, loosely connected to Jewish leadership. So in Rome, they didn't mind showing off that they were the ones in leadership. Sometimes the governor, Pilate being one, they would bring their emblems, their shields, or whatever it may be, into Jerusalem as a sign. And so what's on a shield of Rome? The picture of the Roman emperor. Well, that's an image. When you bring an image into Jerusalem and into the temple, what are you doing for Jewish people? Violating what? Commandment number 1. No graven images. So there were little ways that they would kind of stick it to, first century Jews, that, hey, we were the ones in control, which is why so many Jews saw the Messiah as the one who's going to right the wrong. Romans who are on top, Jews are on the bottom. We're going to flip the script. Jews are going to be on top, Romans are going to be on the bottom. So Jesus is born into this world. He's also born into Judaism at this time could be broken down into three different sections or three different groups. You have the Pharisees being one. Now, we're familiar with this. Again, remember, we're familiar with this first 100 years, probably more so than anything else. Pharisees were lay people. They were the populist group, okay? So, populist in nature. They could care less for Rome, did not care for Hellenistic civilization or way of life. And for them, what was most important was being faithful to the law. And they thought that in their faithfulness to the law, that somehow that was going to lead to an overturn of Roman dominance, mainly seen through the Messiah. And so the Pharisees they legislated morality. So you had the law, and what they did is they looked back on the history of Israel and said, the reason why we had all these different emperors that were ruling us, or all these different empires who controlled us, is because we were not faithful to the law. So we need to make a system so that people, even if they're not following the law, they will follow the law naturally, because we're going to create the laws for them to do so. So if we do that, then we're not going to have the same problems we had in the past. And so that's why you've got all these hundreds of laws that are developed by the Pharisees of how far you could walk on a day. Could you touch this person and not touch this person? Could you touch this animal or not touch this animal? Could you do this or not do that? And it got down to the minute. But the idea was, at least in its concept, it's very good. I think I've shared with y'all before. I think I'm going to have to work on a sermon on this. Pharisees are just theological parents. What does every parent want for their child? I don't want the child to make the same mistakes I made, right? So what do? You try to structure their life so they don't do the same things you did. Well, now, you can argue whether or not it works, because it hasn't worked in my house. Maybe they're not, they haven't made the same mistakes, but, they're and to some degree it didn't work inside of, even with the Pharisees, because one of the critiques of Jesus is that you worship me, with your lips, but what? Your heart's far from me. So, you really can't legislate morality. It doesn't work. And it can work to about this much, but that's really about it. So you have the Pharisees. They're lay people, populists. They're not the ruling class. Now, there's a fair number of them, and the language works with the average person, but the ruling class are here. That's the Sadducees. And the Sadducees, they're actually more conservative than the Pharisees. But they're the aristocracy. They're the priests. They're the landowners. And their whole life revolved around the temple, because it makes sense, all right? The temple, that's where the priests, that's where they, the priestly class are going to be tied to the temple. The temple, you in the country, you went to the synagogue, but in the city, you went to the temple, right? So they're and the Sadducees they're in the background to some degree, ruling class. These are out with the masses. The problem with the Sadducees is when there's a major event that takes place in 70 A.D., and who knows what happened in 70 A.D.? That's exactly right. So there's no need to show off now. You've already answered two, Sherry, so let somebody else answer. Okay. In 70 A.D., the temple is destroyed. There's actually a major revolt in 69, and that's part of the Maccabeans as well there. And because, the Maccabean, it's not just one group. Anytime there was we're against Rome, it's Maccabean. So 70 A.D., 69 A.D. is the revolt. 70 A.D., the Romans come in, flatten everything, destroy the temple. Well, if this is the hub of your existence, and the temple is no more, guess who are gone by then? You can cut out the Sadducees after that. And when the whole country's flattened, just think about what happens when war takes place. Does everybody run down to the courthouse and realize who owned this property or who owned that property and they stay off the property? No. So, it's land grabs, things like that. It's major upheaval after 780. So you have Pharisees, populists, ruling class Sadducees, and then you have this group that's called the Essenes. So you remember when we went to the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? That whole country was out in the sticks, remember? So you drive out of Jerusalem about 2 hours, you go to the Dead Sea and kind of play in the Dead Sea for a little bit. Then you kind of drive up the hill a little bit, and you get all these caves where all these, you get nothing but goat herders and things like that. And one day there's this young boy who's running his goat, and he's throwing rocks in these caves. And guess what? He throws a rock in, and he breaks a jar. And so then he walks in there. Guess what it is? It's all these scrolls of Old Testament writings, particularly that of the prophets. Well, the Essenes would be like the Amish. The Essenes thought that the way you lived out your faith was that you were against all of society, particularly the Roman world. Pharisees wanted to overthrow it. Sadducees found a way to live with it. Essenes said they're all going to hell anyway, so let's go out over here in the cave and we'll just wait for them to die. And so the Essenes were a smaller group. And have you ever heard of the Shakers? All right, so the Shakers, they were actually, there was a big group of Shakers, at least historically, outside of Lexington, Kentucky. You have Lexington and you have Wilmore, where Asbury is located, or actually Wilmore's down here. And then over here was a big community of Shakers. They all died out. You don't find any Shakers anymore. You know why? Because they thought it wasn't good for men and women to be together, other than procreation. And but they, when they worshiped, the men sat on one side, women sat on the other side. Sometimes they would be in different buildings, but eventually they just died out, and because of their aesthetic behavior. And the Essenes are the same people. You also have John the Baptist was an Essene Jew. So what do we know about John the Baptist from the gospel? How's he dressed? He's dressed to the nines, right? And he goes to the barbershop every day, and his beard's well trimmed, and he eats all this gourmet food, right? Yeah, he's the opposite. This is the guy, when you see him at the grocery store, you immediately take your buggy and you go in the other direction. Well, that was the Essenes. That's the horse and buggy in the 21st century. Old school, whatever you want to call it, that's fine. But for them, they were Christ against the culture, or God against. They wouldn't be Christ. God against the culture. Sadducees were God in the culture. Pharisees would be sort of a hybrid between the two. Maybe God transforming the culture to some degree. But these were the people that they didn't want anything to do with the world, and they wanted to create their own society and their own, put a fence around it, and that's who they are. So when Jesus was born, the average Jewish family would be one of these three, or at least have some gravitation towards one of these three. The majority of them were here. This had a threshold you had to cross. All right, so wealth, ruling class. Here this was really not just a belief system, but a very, very different way of life. But all three of these believed in two major things. One is they were monotheistic, one God, and because of what they believed, that affected how they lived. So their ethics or their morals was defined by what they believed. So all three of these were here, and they all had a hope in the Messiah. And the Messiah looked different depending on, where you were. So when you go back and read the Gospels, read the interchange between Jesus when he's talking to the Pharisees or when Jesus is talking to the Sadducees. A lot of times with the Sadducees, it has to deal with resurrection. Sadducees didn't believe in a resurrection. Pharisees did. And, in the beginnings of the gospel where you have these people going out into the wilderness, what's the message from John the Baptist? Y'all are all corrupt, right? Everybody needs to repent. And so they're coming out of the city to the wilderness. But they all had a hope in that somehow the Messiah was going to change the future. That's what eschatological, the end. So all of them, Jesus was born into a world that had a major influence from Rome, either positive or negative, and local people would have been either Pharisees, Sadducees, or Essenes, but they all believed, they were all monotheistic, one God, ethics were derived out of that, and they all believed and hoped in a Messiah. All right. Now again, this really isn't new for us. This was, would be fairly common for what we're familiar with. But what's interesting is after Jesus, so maybe mid-30s A.D., you have the reins are passed to the disciples. We've studied the book of Acts. So there is spreading of the gospel, but it's limited to some degree. Until 70 A.D., so the first major seat, S-E-A-T, of Christianity is Jerusalem. Then in the book of Acts, we see that it's moving a little bit from Jerusalem to Antioch, which is just north. But in 70 A.D., obviously Jerusalem is wiped off the page. So now it becomes Antioch, and the church goes everywhere. So one of a major missional push, again, persecution. So so the seats of Christianity move in the first century, near the end of it. But Christianity was able to spread in the Roman Empire. You would think that it wouldn't because of all the different persecution. But Rome set up a world that travel was easy because of the road system. And they also kept the peace. The Pax Romana, right? The years, centuries of peace. Well, if you're not in war and you got a good infrastructure system and things are at peace and people can move from city to city, well, guess what they did? They took their Priscilla and Aquila. Remember that from the book of Acts? Where does Paul meet them? He meets them. They've been kicked out of Rome because of persecution. Well, they're traveling now to another city. When Paul meets them, does he share the gospel with them? No, they already know it. So there's spread of the gospel in the Roman world because the road system was good. Rome wanted to keep peace more than anything else. In the beginning, Christianity was seen as just a subsection or a sect of Judaism. Judaism was an approved religion, or a approved religion. Yeah, and then but eventually there's a split in the Roman eyes between Judaism and Rome into the book of Acts, remember? So when Paul is arrested in Jerusalem, this is probably around Acts, 20? And he's beaten, and then they take him in, and they're going to argue. A lot of the Jews are quick to say he's not one of us. And because that's when you start to see the split between the Jews and the Rome, at least in the Roman eyes. But around the mid-50s, mid-60s, there is persecution. There are pockets of that, but Christianity spreads like crazy, and so you have the formation of the Bible because you have Christian leaders writing to these places that either they started a church or church already existed. When Paul writes to the church at Rome, did Paul start Rome? No. We don't know who started the Church of Rome, but he's already writing to a group. Did Paul? He didn't start all the churches that he wrote letters to, but they were already there, and some of that's because it was easy for the word to spread inside the Roman world. But around the end of the first century, so Christianity has roots now for about 70 years. You've got a transition from one generation to the next. So at the end of the first century, you have what is called the rise of the apologists. So apologists are the ones who are going to defend the faith. Oral tradition was the major way that the faith was transmitted from one person to the next. Eventually, the written part of it, like with the letters. But the Bible wasn't, you have people collecting letters, but the Bible is not canonized for a couple of centuries later. Or that is the New Testament. Think about it. So if you have the Gospels that are in the 60s, 70s, maybe late 80s, and then you've got the epistles that are probably 50s and 60s and 70s, so they're being written in the second part of the first century. So, what would happen is you would read it like at St. Paul, and then you'd run down to St. Luke and you'd read it. Then you'd run over here, maybe to Pierce Chapel, and you'd read it. You'd go up to this place and you'd read it. And so, but eventually people start to collect them. But that comes later. But you have Christianity's been in place now for 70 years. And so it's starting to make inroads into different communities. And would you think it would be easy for people to misconstrue things? So let me ask you this. Why is gossip so bad? All right, it defames a person, so take that out. But think about the accuracy of truth. So gossip is always a good indicator of accuracy, right? Why not? Normally, if I tell Sherry, y'all remember you played this probably with a little girl, elementary school. You say one thing to one person, they say one thing to one person, and it makes its way around. By the time it gets back to the first person, it might or might not be exactly what the first person said. Well, again, you don't have a Bible yet. So you have people spreading Christianity, but if I'm, say, part of the Pharisees, and I spread Christianity to part of the Sadducees, they're going to some degree, the gospel makes inroads into this way of life and this way of thinking. Well, eventually it leads Judaism, and it shows up in the Roman world, who you might have somebody that believes this before being a Christian, then they believe that. So part of the struggle with the Corinth church is you've got all these different people that were either religious, tied to other religions, or they were not religious at all, but they become a Christian, but they bring in their whole way of life. And everybody lives the same, right? Do you live the same as the person next to you? Oh, you got to be kidding me. You don't? No, we don't. We're all from the same area for the most part. Could you imagine if you lived? Well, let me ask you this way: do you think if you went to a church in India, a Methodist church in India, it would look like St. Paul? No. So you can see what it's like in this first level of Christianity when there really is no formal worship service. There's all access is that they devoted themselves to the teaching of the apostles, the breaking of the bread, and to praying. Well, everything else was local customs. And so you can imagine what that would look like. And so you would have these people that came from different backgrounds, but they would receive the gospel, but then they would want to tweak the gospel to sort of be a hybrid of what they used to be and what they are now. So that's where we have the beginning of all the heresies. And there are three major ones. One is a little bit different, but we put it as a heresy. And the first one is Gnosticism. And Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis. It's where we get knowledge from. And so, see, I'm going to tell you what Gnosticism is, and I want you to think about how close it sounds to Christianity. So, Gnosticism believed that human beings basically were evil, but they also had a divine spark or some level of divinity inside of them, and what they needed was the right knowledge, the right gnosis, to unlock what's already, that part of divinity that's there. And then if they receive that, then they grow into something that is God, that favors or looks similar to God. All right, that sounds a little bit like, not quite, but close. Christianity believes that human beings are basically sinful, right? That there is something that we call the Imago Dei, which in some form or fashion, what's been marred or fallen or whatever it may be, is still this idea that we're created in the image of God, but that we do need something for salvation, right? For Gnosticism, what they felt or what they believed is that anything that's of matter, physical, is evil. And so your body's evil, things like that, it'll decay. And what's on the inside, your spirit, is something that reflects the divine. And that if you can receive the right gnosis, the right knowledge, then you're going to unlock your divinity. So it sounds a little like Christianity, on one level. It definitely sounds more Christian than, say, if you were a part of some paganistic religion that was tied to Rome. But after you dive down about an inch, you realize that it doesn't hold water. But so Gnosticism, there was, people, some Gnostic people said that, hey, we're just like you. We're Christians too, because Gnosticism was looking for the great Redeemer who would impart the gnosis to everyone. Well, who do they think they chose? Jesus. And so in the beginning, when around the end of the first century, you have these people who start to take on Gnosticism and say, no, we're not even close. You think you are, but we're not. Gnosticism actually had this whole scheme of deity where you actually had a, mother and father God. They, it's kind of Hellenistic in its understanding. They have a baby God, and then that baby, then on down to eventually the line that divides, say divinity and humanity. Eventually humans are born, and they have just a small spark or an essence of what they used to be like up here. So somebody's got to come and unlock them so that they can go back home. Scientology is a modern-day version of Gnosticism. All right? So, I remember I had a professor that would say, heresies really never go away. We just change their names. And he's accurate. But Gnosticism was there's so much writing on Gnosticism if you want to. If you have lived a full life and you need some boredom, go feel free to read some Gnostic writings and you'll be asleep. If you have if you have insomnia, just read Gnosticism. So part of what they dealt with was Gnosticism. Part of another big heresy inside the area was something called Docetism, and that comes from the Greek word to appear. And what some people believed, similar to Gnosticism, that anything that is of matter is, that's physical, is evil. So there's no way in the world Jesus could be evil, so he could not have had a body. So when the disciples thought they saw Jesus, they really didn't. He just appeared sort of like maybe a ghost or something, and but he didn't possess any type of physical body, because there was no way in the world, because that would mean he was evil. He's of God. Can't be that way. So one of the reasons why the Gospels puts so much information around the incarnation is to deal with this. I mean, so all of the Gospels talk about Jesus being born, right? They talk about, you get all types of information around his body. It talks about his beatings, things like that, death and resurrection. What is one of the things that Jesus does to the disciples in the Gospel of John in post-resurrection? He shows them what? Hands and side. And he goes to Thomas and says, do what? Touch. Touch what? Hands and side. It also, it talks about, it puts a good amount of information on Jesus eating with the disciples. Well, I mean, if you're a ghost, you don't need to eat. You know, if you're just appearing, sort of like kind of faking it, maybe it's an avatar. You know, Jesus' avatar showed up. No, that's not right. So, but there were some people. So if you're Greek and you think everything that's physical is evil, and then all of a sudden you hear about Jesus and you believe in Jesus, but you've got this old thinking that says, man, there's no way. I mean, I was taught since a little boy or a little girl that anything that's physical's of evil. Anything that's made up of matter is evil. Then there's no way in the world that Jesus could be made of matter. Well, I mean, what you have in the first century is the church going to great lengths to say, no, that's not the way it is. He actually was incarnate, which means he's made up of human flesh. And then the last major heresy is a guy by the name of Marcion. And Marcion was one of the first collectors of the New Testament. But Marcion believed that he saw Christianity as the third wave of God's movement. The first wave was in the Old Testament, and the way God revealed himself then was a God of wrath and a God of judgment. All right? So he said, we don't want that anymore. He said Jesus was the second wave, and Jesus set the stage for the real important wave, which was the wave of the Spirit. And so for Marcion, the only thing that he wanted to read about and hear about was being now in this new Pentecost understanding of being in the Spirit. And so he actually started collect writings, New Testament, eventually what would become New Testament writings, particularly Paul's writings, because Paul writes so much about being in the Spirit. He would tell people to rip out part of Paul's letters that had to do with Jesus, or rip out some of Paul's letters that had to do with the Old Testament, because now we're in the age of the Spirit. And so everything, it's a little loosey-goosey. That's a nice theological word, right? Marcion, there are a lot of folks that liked it, all right? And but when you read the New Testament, you can't justify both of those. I mean, you can't justify his thoughts and align those, because the New Testament speaks so much about the Old Testament and the New Testament. Paul's writing ties in both of them. So David Koresh, remember him, right? He would buy into Marcion. Interesting. Marcion had about 9 million wives, and fashioned himself the age of the Spirit guru. And so there, Jim Jones, Marcion, all right. So again, they just changed the name, but it sounds good, right? I mean, so here would be the lesson for us, is that when anybody in the name of Christ talks about that they have new revelation, you need to run for the doors. So, all right, y'all don't take my word for it. This is your homework. You go home and Google it up or whatever. Study it over a period of time. Normally, it ends up in two different things: improper sexual behavior, or I want your money. All right, so don't take my word for it. Marcion, he's an example, okay? And there are Marcions that show up all throughout the church's history, and they're even here today, right? And but if I'm If I stand up and I say, I'm the one under the direction of the Spirit, I have revelation for you, to be faithful to God, this is what God has in store for you. Right? Well, that sounds good. It definitely sounds good from my end, particularly if I'm the one that's given the revelation. Well, I mean, so this is, so what the church did is the church saw the fallacy in his argument, but then at the same time also looked at his behavior. Some of the things that the apologists also had dealt with is, from the Roman perspective, early Christians were called incestuous. They referred to people as brother and sister. They had these love feasts that were private. Right? We serve open communion today, which means that you don't have to be a member of a congregation. You just have to be thankful to God, to come and receive. In the first century, again, it's a minority, all right? So, and it was against the law to be a Christian. So everything that took place that we think is open, for them it was private. Well, if you refer to, brothers, sisters in Christ, you go behind the doors for your own private meal and your own private gathering, well, you can imagine what an outsider might think. Well, they thought the love feasts, to some degree, were drunken orgies. And so part of what the apologists had to address was, no, that wasn't the case. They also thought early Christians were cannibals. All right? So they thought they were a subsection of Judaism. They saw Jews as being barbaric, which means then they're going to see Christians as being barbaric. And then if Christians talked about eating the flesh of the body of Christ and drinking the blood of Christ, well, you can imagine what they thought. So, and listen, and it was transubstantiation back then. You know what that is? That's where when they, you bless the elements, it literally turns into the body and blood. The Reformation is where we have the beginnings of consubstantiation, which is that it's symbolic. They also thought that Christians were intellectually ignorant. So think about 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians, Paul writes, there's this interplay also in Colossians and some of those writings around those that are foolish and wisdom. Right? So you remember all that? Particularly if you go back and read the first 3 chapters of the book of 1 Corinthians. Corinthians chapter 3, he talks a lot about this, where you have this play on foolishness and a play on wisdom. And some of that is addressing what outsiders believed about Christians. Christians didn't quote Greek philosophers. They quoted Old Testament prophets. They thought they were ignorant because they would try to hold together omnipotence, transcendence of God, at the same time that God would actually be active in everybody's life. So for, again, Romans, Hellenists who prided themselves on intellectual ability, the study of the classics, things like that. You didn't have that with Christians. So the way that the church eventually deals with these heresies, they have certain apologists, Justin Martyr being one, Irenaeus being one, Tertullian being another one. But they came up with 3 major ways to address it. The first one is what we call the canon, which is what? The Bible, the Scriptures. And so you actually, after 100 AD, you actually have Christian pockets, communities, that are starting to collect letters, but there are other letters. They're like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary. They're other writings that are going on at this period of time, but they say they're important, but they're just not saying they're not of the same level. So you have the beginning of the collection of the Bible that eventually gets ratified in 325. So it takes about 100 years for all these different communities to collect these different letters. Around the end of the 2nd century, if you were to look at, say, the 7 or 8 major Christian pockets or centers of people, And if you were to look at what they considered to be spiritual or inspired and what are not, they're about 87% common. Now, these are people, it's not like, Harriet called Sandy and said, hey, what letters do you have? I mean, it wasn't none of that. It was like, Harriet's community would collect their writings, and they had theirs. Sandy's would collect hers. Shane would collect his. Sherry collect hers. But if you go and study those, there's an overwhelming commonality, and they're not even connected to each other. They don't even know each other. Well, that's fairly significant. But in 325, they finally hash out the 27 books that they consider to be canonical, and the other ones are important. So the Bible, even though it's not on the same par that it is as in post-Reformation, it is at least an authority early on. Equally as important to the Bible are the creeds. So the Nicene creeds, there are other creeds. The Trinitarian creeds, baptism. One of the first creeds, even though it's not an official document, is you have these different pockets of people, these sinners, and they're baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But you have the beginning of these creeds, and the creeds are defining teachings for the church. And so if a teaching failed outside of the creeds, then it was not approved. So the Bible is important, the creeds are important, and then the last one is what we call apostolic succession, and that is the leadership. It doesn't pass down bloodlines, all right, which is significant because for thousands of years, how does leadership fall? It falls around houses. Prince Philip died, right? So you're seeing all this information now about the Queen and and all that stuff. The House of Windsor, right? So and the next king's going to be what's it? Harry? Is that his name? And it is Harry, right? Is it Harry? No. Who is it? Harry's the young one, right? Okay. Charles. I thought they bypassed Charles to the son. Who's the oldest grandson? Who's Diana's first child? William. That's the one. I thought it was William. Sorry. I thought they bypassed Charles so that he could marry Camilla. I don't know. I'm not up to date on the Queen. Isn't that the show on Netflix? I'll get to that here soon, and then eventually I'll be up to date on my British modern history. But in the church, it falls down faith lines and leadership lines. So obviously you go from Jesus to the disciples, and then from the disciples to the disciples' disciple. All right? So, even though Paul wasn't a part of the original disciples, he's sort of seen as an apostle. So from Paul, one of the places of changing of leadership would be from Paul to who? Timothy. Or from Paul to Titus. John, who wrote the Revelation and the Gospel of John, most people, and I think the evidence I think is clear, even though we don't have an official document. From John, it goes to a guy by the name of Polycarp. And I like Polycarp. I think Polycarp is just a brilliant saint. If you're interested in reading about it, the end of his life is worth it. It's very humble, and he eventually martyred. And he ends up cooking dinner for the guards that eventually will take him to the magistrate so that he'll be tried. And nobody, even the magistrate didn't want to kill him because he was such a good guy. And basically gave him opportunities to recant. He's like 87 years old. And his last words were, for 87 years, he has treated me, how do you say it? For 87 years, he has been so good to me. Why in my last minutes would I not be good to him? And of course, then he was basically forced the magistrate's hand, and eventually he is put to death. But they fall down faith lines, and eventually till you get to where the 4th century, where you have the rise of the Pope. Now, and of course, now in Catholicism, they would trace their, so the Pope in Rome, they trace their apostolic succession back to who? Don't be afraid. Peter, that's right, Peter. Because that place in Matthew's gospel where they say that, where Jesus asks, who do you say that I am? And eventually Peter says, you are the Christ. Says, well, modern wisdom, no wisdom gave you that other than the Spirit of God. And then eventually goes on to say, on this rock I will build my church. And of course he's talking to Peter. So the apostolic succession line, at least for popes, for them, they theologically, they say it dates back to Peter, who they say was the first leader of the church in Rome. So, but now eventually, so I'll give you, we're going to talk about this later on in a couple of weeks, but just kind of want to, I got 1 minute, so let me just kind of, so for 1,500 years, these are the three authorities, and they're of equal weighting. All right, now, but for us, we wouldn't say the creeds are, you definitely, well, maybe you would with me being in the room. You might say the apostolic succession is as important as the canon, but probably not. So what happens with the Reformation is that this group is in need of reform. The clergy just aren't doing what they should be doing. They're abusing power left and right. I'm sure there's a Netflix show on this as well too, right? So both sides of the house, what would become the Protestants and what would be the Catholics, hold this as being true. So you can't critique this group with something that both people agree with, right? So the way that the Protestants reform the church is they elevate this to a level of primal authority. So two things that come out of the Reformation is what we call sola gratia, only grace, or sola scriptura, only the Scriptures. So you wonder why the Bible is such that it is today. Well, you can thank the Reformation, not the early church. Now, it doesn't mean the Bible's not important, but the Bible was one of three authorities. But after the Reformation, because of the way the methodology of reform took place, the Bible becomes the even trumps tradition or leadership. All right, so you got a bunch of history. Now you can go take a nap. But you can see I tried to at least tie in some of the ways that it's connected to the New Testament when we talked about like Corinthians or Revelations or something like that. What I'm grateful about the history is, one, we have a myopic view of it. Most time, whenever somebody looks back on history, it's myopic. But when you sort of study with it over a period of time, you really can see God's hand, shielding the church and the Spirit bringing about levels of reform wherever it may be, so that it moves, it keeps all of what we talked about on the backside. It keeps that moving, centered around the person of Jesus. And so I think it's important to learn and to see the connections with it. And at the same time, you are never alone. You are in a line of people who have sought to do what you're trying to do now, to hold what you hold dear in faith and to put that into life to where you live it out. And sometimes it's easy for us to think just because our life is only our experience. And it can be lonely there, particularly when it's not an easy period of time. But you are, the Hebrews, a long line of witnesses, never goes away. You are part of a connection of people that faith-wise date back to Jesus himself, so that you could see the revelation of God and how that plays out in a life, in thick and in thin. And so when you think about the history of the church, as boring as it can be, because it can be, you also need to see that the history was made up of individual Christians trying to do the very same thing that you're doing now. I want to learn, I want to grow, and I want to be faithful. And so you are, in 2,000 years, if, Lord willing, someone else will be studying our history and will connect that dots all the way back to the beginning. So be encouraged. And also go in peace. So next week, John's going to talk a little bit about Paul. I've got to go get Caroline from Belmont. But then the week after that, we're going to pick up with the Council of Nicaea, and I want to show you why that is as important as it is. All right? Y'all have a good week.